The pool of reflection in front of us, okay guys? Pool of reflection. Yeah. Pool of, we'll get a bit closer, let's get to the bottom of those steps.
Guys, be careful. If you stick your head underwater, do you know a posteriori you drown?
Okay, so here we are at the War Memorial here in Hyde Park. This memorial was built in the early 1930s. I think it was probably commissioned in 1929 or something like that. And who was the name of the architect? The architect was Dellet, who was commissioned to do it and oversee its construction. And then the architect Dellet commissioned a sculptor by the name of Rayner Hoff to sculpture many of the figures and decorative aspects that we see within the War Memorial. So the reason I'm talking to you now and not Mario is because I know a little bit about Rayner Hoff, okay, the sculptor, not the architect. He actually so look, I'll give you a little bit of biographical details about Rayner Hoff. He was from England. He was born in 1894 he was actually born on the Isle of Man, but then his family moved to Nottingham, England, where he first worked in a stonemason's yard, just carving and hacking stone while he was still at school. At the age of 14, he commenced work in an architect's office, and later furthered his architectural training by taking up architectural drawing at the Nottingham School of Art, where he was realised for what sort of a talent he was. However, in 1915, Rayner Hoff himself enlisted in the army and went to the Western Front. So he saw service on the Western Front himself, although fighting as an Englishman, but presumably fighting side by side with Australians. Now, after the war, he went to the Royal College of Art in London, where he studied sculpture under Francis Derwent Wood, and in 1922 he won the Prix de Rome, a architect award. He arrived out in Sydney in 1923, okay, to head up the School of Sculpture out at the then East Sydney Technical College, which is in the grounds of the former Darlinghurst prison behind the Darlinghurst courtyard. So if you walk down Oxford Street down there, it's only about a 10-minute walk. In fact, there's a 10-minute walk I used to make every morning from the train station over there, because that school is continuous with the National Art School, NAS, which is where I studied fine art. And that's how I come to know something about Rayner Hoff. So he founded the School of Sculpture down there. If you go down there today, you can see some of his models and relief models that are up there in the buildings. Now, he also, because he also established that as his studio. Now, Rayner Hoff, he was commissioned in 1925 to build a war memorial out of Dubbo. And then in 1927, he built a similar but smaller, more modest building, although with some quite exquisite sculptures, as the War Memorial North Terrace in Adelaide, South Australia. And then, of course, Dellet commissioned him to do the sculptures here in 1930. What's interesting about all of this, and what some of the context that we have to keep in mind, is what this is. This is a memorial to what was called the Great War, often what we call the First World War. Of course, at the time, in the aftermath of the First World War, they didn't know there was going to be a Second World War. In fact, some of them called it the war to end all wars. This was the Great War. This was a war like none in history ever before, where millions upon millions of both sides had died. Devastating death, right? And for a small, I know it's a great landmass, Australia, but, small population, okay, to lose almost a whole generation of their toughest young men, this was devastating. Devastating for the psyche of the nation. And you go through any little Australian town, and somewhere you'll see a war memorial. Usually just a catafalque, which is like a fake tomb sort of thing, decorated, or a statue of a soldier on a plinth. Okay, but as we would expect in a big city like this, we want to have something impressive, something solemn. Okay, so Hoff was commissioned. He did 16 seated figures that you can see around the outside of the built structure. 4 corner figures, one for each of the services. So you got Army, Navy, Air Force, and then a nurse. Okay, military nurse. Okay, on the corners, and then there's also, we can't see them, but on the sides there is actually 2 large bas reliefs in cast bronze. When we go inside, what we'll see there is, there's 120,000 stars on the ceiling, which he kind of designed the star of, but they're representing the Australian war dead. Okay, as well as 4 relief panels showing the March of Death, but also having the themes of Army, Navy, Air Force, and the Medical Corps. And also you'll see a marble reef, and then you've got the main figure of sacrifice as we look down. A soldier across a sword, across a shield. Okay, what you will find interesting, okay, is the way that while this is a secular monument in a sense, right, it is a kind of secular liturgical space. This is a place where you can come on Anzac Day, lay wreaths, ceremonies can go on here that remember the dead, but also in post-Christian Enlightenment Australia, it is one that doesn't really escape its Christian roots. And you'll see something of the Christian symbolism, in the soldier laying dead, but in a cruciform shape. Okay, there was some unfinished parts of it, and a little bit of controversy. Rayner Hoff had also designed some plaster cast to be made into model bronze elements that were to sit on the outside that were never completed. One called the Crucifixion of Civilization, 1914. It wasn't made in 1914. It was labelled the Crucifixion of Civilization, 1914. Okay, which is the beginning of the war. Okay, and the other one called Victory After Sacrifice, 1918. So that would be the 2 ends. Now, he displayed these, the plaster casts, before they were cast into bronze, and it featured some naked women in them, and that was quite controversial in the day. You could get away with naked men, but not naked women. And the controversy got really quite heated, and he refused to budge on his original design. Okay, he wasn't going to redesign it without the naked women, and he ended up destroying the plaster cast images. Okay, so in that we do, you just listen to the names, the Victory After Sacrifice, Crucifixion of Civilization. There is something of the Christian heritage in it. Yet many of the detractors of this building, many of the people that don't like this building, and I don't really know personally where I stand on it in terms of its architecture and its beauty. Many of the detractors will say that there is something actually quite aggressively pagan about it. Or others will say it is very much reminiscent of the particular humanism of the fascism which was being fought against, in both those world wars. So I'll leave that to your own judgment, but undoubtedly you can see it is while impressive, it is impressive in a very bold sense, a lot less elegant than some of the things we've been looking at.
Thank you, Chris. That's a wonderful kind of filling in the contours in a very nuanced way with Hoff's art. I'm just going to say a few brief things about the externals and their practicalities. That it's made of granite and marble blocks. Okay, synthetic stone material was used for the statues that you see sitting on top of these exterior. I guess they're supports, aren't they?
Yeah, buttresses.
They're buttresses. Yeah. They're buttresses, right? Very much Art Deco. The needle-like tower in the centre there is something that you will see in other Art Deco designs, whether it's the Empire State Building in New York City. There's that needle-like structure which scrapes the sky in a golden. It's bronze. It's a bronze piece of art within the Empire State Building itself. So very Art Deco in a sense. These sidewoods blocky figures that you see in the, you say it was a bronze bas relief on either side. They're bronze bas reliefs on either side. You will see them when we go around on the other side. Maybe we can walk over together and have a closer look at them on this side. Kind of mirroring what you see further up in the synthetic stone images of the servicemen as well. This is, I wouldn't call it fascist, it's characteristic of, let's say, the kind of, because in the Soviet Union you'll find similar stuff. It's kind of strong man fighting forward. If you look at, for example, the Space Museum, the main Space Museum in Moscow, it has very similar stuff as well, right? So it's depicting a kind of sense of movement in relation to the war. You've got bracketed the dates of the Great War on either side here, 1914 to 1918, and these designs with flames coming out of, presumably those cauldrons up there, symbolise the kind of where the flames would be lit. Basically, from a broader point of view or perspective in terms of civilization, as Chris already elegantly pointed out, you have a shift away from emphatic Christian imagery, but it cannot escape some of its Christian roots, especially with the crucified soldier in the centre, who is labelled sacrifice. Well, the sacrifice of war, people dying in order to protect their families at home and their nations, kind of mirroring in a way, although it's very different, the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, who dies as a victim. Okay, obviously Jesus' sacrifice is entirely pacifist, right? He allows his enemies to crucify him. So the correlation can only be loose, because even in war, and I'm not saying people have to protect their nations, there's a whole just war theory in St. Augustine, but it's different. It has to do with externalized battles, not this self-sacrificial giving up out of love for one's enemy that Christ embodies. In this period, because of the depopulation of the public space in relation to saints, public Christian festivals, they will be celebrated by various communities and churches, like the Catholic Church. Yeah, it will have its litanies outside and its processions and all these sorts of things, but they're not necessarily sponsored by the government, right? The government has to have its own ideology, its own religion. This is not just for Australia. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and that's known as civil religion. In civil religion, the public feast days that were adhered to by everyone within a city or state or country, right, that had to do with Christian festivals. Well, Christmas and Easter are an exception, but you'd have festivals dedicated to various saints and everything else. The saints are replaced in the public space by soldiers, more or less. This begins in France with the French Revolution. It becomes popular in the United States, the Declaration of Independence in the period thereafter, and it's really, of course, going to be prominent with the Great War and later the Second World War. So that's just a bit of a larger let's say, broader historical perspective, that in the public space now, you need another way. You're not going to use the church as a way to gather everyone's sentiments and emotions and rally them around let's say, central belief. The belief is the belief in the nation. That's what the government will espouse, the state will espouse. And the nation's heroes are its war dead. And the war dead, just like the saints. The saints are martyrs. They die for Christ. Some are long dead. The war dead die as martyrs for the nation, if you like. You can see that parallel. We'll talk more about that next week. Let's go inside. Inside it's a tripartite structure. The very top is the Hall of Memory. In the middle is the Hall of Silence, where you can look down upon the crucified, sacrificed soldier. And the very bottom is the Hall of Service, where various names of battles are inscribed and everything else. You'll see that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering, would you say that that initially the ANZAC ceremonies and etc. would have had a more explicitly Christian character in their onset, because it was put together by an Anglican priest, like for instance the ceremonies and the
Yeah, look, and what's central to most ANZAC Day ceremonies is a catafalque. What's the other term for it?
Catafalque.
Yeah, which is basically, or in St Mary's Cathedral, I don't know if you noticed it, there is actually a tomb to the unknown soldier. So they've actually taken a body from one of the killing fields, probably from the Western Front, and they don't know who it is. They've buried him there as a representative. Now, if you go to the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, likewise they have buried there an unknown soldier, soldier, whereas the catafalque down on Martin Place, it is just a stone block, but you will but it is treated like a tomb and like an altar. If we actually reflect back to our Catholic tradition, right, of altars, right, I don't know if you guys know this, or maybe you've covered this in the course, but in the very early church in Rome, when the church was in persecution and the martyrs were murdered, they were often buried in subterranean graveyards called the catacombs, right? And so you had the tomb of the martyr there, against the wall in a little room in a catacomb. Now, it made sense for the Christians sort of hiding out and stuff, that where they would go to worship would be down in the catacombs with the tombs of the martyrs. And what they would actually do is, because the martyr has sacrificed and died with Christ, and because they're having the Eucharist, the Mass, which is the sacrifice of Christ remade present, and the body of Christ remade present, okay, it made sense to say Mass on the tomb of the martyr and to use that as the altar. Now, after the Edict of Milan and the emancipation of Christianity in the Roman Empire, right, they didn't lose this practice, but they actually took those physical tombs out of the catacombs and put them in the basilicas and used them as altars. Or they just built a whole new basilica, like St. Peter's, on top of where St. Peter, the martyr, was buried, so that the altar is directly above where that is. So there is this association with the tomb of the martyr, with the place of sacrifice, and the place of worship, the place of giving honour. Okay, and that sort of mentality then carries over even into our secular liturgia, our secular public giving, our public ritual, in the idea of the association of sacrifice and giving honour, reverence, religio.
And it doesn't necessarily, even though it might have been self-consciously done at the beginning, well, now we're not all emphatically Catholic, so we won't do a specifically... Well, the Catholic prayers for the dead are said, for the war dead are said, and everything else. It shouldn't be seen as conflicting necessarily, because definitely in a situation where you have a polity, a state that has many religions, many different ethnicities, you need a public ritualization of such shocking and traumatic events. It cannot be otherwise. The Great War. How are you going to commemorate all these dead publicly when some are Sikhs, some are Muslims, some are Buddhists, some are Catholics? Well, you find a way to do it in a neutral way like this, and then you still have, for example, your services in the church, which is what you were referring to earlier, the catafalque to the unknown soldier within St Mary's Cathedral. Yes,
and look, these things aren't even just post-Christian. This grace builds on nature. You know, our natural religious instinct tells us to give honour where honour is due.
Yeah.
And we naturally should honour those who have died in the service of our nation. You know, that natural religious instinct, by that instinct, surrounds itself with religious ceremony, with monuments, with that sort of stuff. And you know, that is the nature by which then we actually, the Holy Spirit, of course, is to build our religion.
Is there any particular idea behind the stone graves? Like it's like a monster, or it's like a pagan stone deity. It's all over the place. They're above the bed.
Well, that's
I'll let you talk because
So that's actually there's the Australian military services badge is this emblem called the rising sun. Now, there's quite a bit of debate as to the history of it, but there was a military barracks somewhere where above the doorway it was set up with an interchange of swords and bayonets, just arranged in a fancy looking thing. But this has become emblematic of the Australian military services. So you will often see the rising sun, those rays coming out, with a crown set in the middle of them, which was the original badge of the Australian military services, or with a kangaroo and a crown. But also different corps and battalions within the Australian Army will have the rising sun, but they would have different things incorporated into the middle of them. So that's just an Australian military motif that's been incorporated fittingly into the building.
Let's go inside. Oh, friends, there's a ziggurat structure at the top, step pyramid, which is interesting because the War Memorial in Melbourne also has a ziggurat at the top with a skylight where the light falls through onto a verse from St. John's Gospel. So, ziggurats we saw were characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization, landing pads for the gods, stairways to heaven. That's being evoked in this confluence of Art Deco, some classical, also ancient designs. And the Hall of Silence, guys, quiet rest.
Down on the sculpture of sacrifice there, you might notice that the figure of sacrifice himself, the soldier on the shield with the sword, is supported on a column with some sculptured figures of some women. And I just want to read to you some words that from Rayner Hoff, the sculptor on this. Thousands of women, although not directly engaged in the war activities, lost all that was dear to them. There was no acknowledgement in them in the casualty lists of wounded, maimed and killed. In this spirit, I have shown them carrying their load, the sacrifice of their menfolk.
This is the Hall of Memory, actually. It's the Hall of Memory. Hall of Memory, and that's the Hall of Silence there. Silence, yeah, I got it wrong before. Hall of Memory, Hall of Silence, and the Hall of Service is underneath. It's all marble.